Now we're going to move on to the Poaceae, which is going to turn out to be a very important group of plants. Our first group, our first family in this group is the Bromeliaceae. It's particularly unique in that it's largely of New World tropics distribution. So we've got southern US and South America, and it includes the plant that gives us pineapples. So the pineapple plant is one of the very few who is rooted in the ground, so it's a terrestrial member of this family. Pretty much everything else in this family has this epiphytic habit. In other words, it grows on other plants, much like orchids. And much like orchids, they will hold on to water, and how they do that is typically by having tanks. So this would be a tank of bromeliad. If you were to kind of tip it over, a whole bunch of water would fall out. So it has a reservoir of water in it. And there are lots of mosquitoes and poison dart tree frogs in the tropics, etc., that will use these as unique habitat. So ecologically, they're pretty interesting too. We have one member in Alabama, and that is Spanish moss. Now, those of you who are down south, you'll be able to find Spanish moss. Rarely will you find it flowering, but if you find it flowering, that's an awesome photo. Spanish moss is an aerial plant. It still does photosynthesis. It is not a parasite or anything. Is not a moss, even though it's called a moss. So that's a good one to add to your plant photo collections. In terms of utility, Spanish moss was used as stuffing, mattresses, etc., for some people that lived on bayous, but it's not a whole lot of use these days other than to be very characteristic of the southeast. So we're in the home stretch now, but we're getting to some pretty important groups of plants. The Cyperaceae, not terribly important, although in the terms of development of human societies, Cyperaceae was pretty important because there's one kind of sedge, which is the common name for this group, the Cyperaceae. One kind of sedge that was used by the Egyptians to make papyrus or paper. So that's an important sort of ethnobotanical aspect of this plant. This is a pretty abundant group. This family has over 5,000 species throughout the world, so that's going to be pretty highly ranked on your list. It's not as much as orchids or some of the other things that we'll see, but it's up there, certainly top 10. Almost 1,000 in the US and over 360 in Alabama. Now, sedges are somewhat distinctive in that they have edges. I think Charles showed us this when we were out at Turkey Creek. They are triangular, so they have edges. If you were to pick up this sedge in your hand and twirl it, it would be triangular. It has three sort of parts of the stem. Leaves also have three parts. They feel like they have three parts. So they will either be fully triangular or they'll be kind of V-shaped, but they will not have mucilage in them like the members of the Commelinaceae. So they're going to look very grass-like, but they have edges. The edges are very rough, kind of saw-like. You do not want to do this, but if you were to run your fingers along the edge of this leaf and do it press too hard, you could actually cut yourself. But if you want to do that real gently, you can kind of feel the edges, the sawtooth edges of those leaves. So the sort of mnemonic device is sedges have edges. They are used as ornamentals. They're kind of pretty plants. They have a worldwide distribution. Boy, you can find a sedge anywhere. But beware, when you're trying to identify sedges, especially with using photographs, they can be extremely difficult to identify to species. So unless you are very confident and you get very distinctive, very good photos, and someone comes on iNaturalist and identifies them, don't plan on being able to get them distinctively to species for sure. There can be a very difficult group, and there's a lot of species. Now, one of the things that I want to point out that is unique to this group is that they are wind pollinated. Everything we've talked about so far in the monocots are all insect pollinated. But here this trait, which is an ancestral trait, has re-emerged in this group of monocots, Cyperaceae, are wind pollinated. So here is the inflorescence. It looks relatively bland. It's not attractive to any insects at all because they're wind pollinated. Let's finish with the most economically important family that we will talk about the whole semester, the Poaceae. This is the grass family. You've already had a member of the grass family that we've learned in lab. And it was Poa, which is the type genus of the family, Poaceae. This is definitely top 5 in terms of numbers of species, both in the world, in the US, and in Alabama. Over 10,000 species in the world, highly species rich. And in terms of economic importance, there is not a more important plant. This plant feeds more people than, or this plants in this family feed more people than any other food in the entire world. So this is economically, you can't get anything more important than that. They are all, like all the other monocots, they are all herbaceous, except for things like bamboo, which is not truly woody, but you wouldn't also call it herbaceous. The flowers are very reduced and they are very unique, and they end up having a whole bunch of bizarre terms with them. So anther we can get our hands around. We can kind of understand what the anther of grasses. We can understand the stigma, so that term makes sense. Ovary, okay, fine. But there's also this new terminology that gets introduced with grasses, the lemma, the palea, the lodicule. So we're not going to deal with any of those things in terms of identifying grasses. Grasses can be really difficult to identify to species. So if you're photographing grasses, try to make sure that you photograph a lot of very up-close aspects of the plant. Now grasses are also wind pollinated, and lots of people that have spring and summer allergies, that's because of grasses. So grass pollen is flying through the air all over the place, and you can imagine that if you are a grass getting pollinated and you're wind pollinated, that the stigmatic surface should be very broad and fan-like, like they are. So that's an adaptation that allows them to capture this wind-borne pollen. Now, if sedges have edges, grasses have knees. So these knees are, they've got a round stem, and then there's a very distinct kind of knee-like node that looks kind of like a joint. So if you want to narrow it down to grass, you need to look for a round stem, flat leaves, and then this little joint on the stem. This is a plant that has a flower display, but also a seed display that is called a panicle. And you'll remember panicle from when we talked about flowers. And this particular grass is known as panic grass, not because it induces panic, but because its inflorescence and its seed display is a panicle. One aspect too, if you're trying to identify a plant that's a grass, 2 species, you'll often have to look at this ligule. The ligule is the attachment point for the leaf to the stem, and so it would be right around here on this plant. And this particular ligule has hairs around the collar, and it may or may not have a feature that kind of stands up. These are some of the distinctive features that you need to photograph to be able to identify grasses. Again, they can be very tough. Some useful grasses that we have. Wow, there's a lot of uses. So there's construction. Some places in Asia where bamboos grow very large and very strong can be used for structures. So this is a recreation of, I think it's around 1/3 size, the Eiffel Tower. They made it out of bamboo. The real Eiffel Tower, of course, is made out of metal, but this one was recreated, made out of bamboo. Big coverings can be made like this. Warehouse area can be made of bamboo. I've even seen pictures of bicycles made out of bamboo. So it can be a very strong, very tough substance. Like other grasses, it has a round stem and it's hollow on the inside. So these stands of bamboo, they are all hollow on the inside. Other economically important members of the grass family. Now keep in mind that all of their seeds are grains. So when you think of grains that go in your cereal, you're thinking of grasses. So corn, rice, oats, barley, bread wheat, rye, etc. So many different sources of food throughout the world and throughout history with people. The enzymes that are in barley are particularly high for freeing sugars out of the starch compounds that are used in seeds. So those enzymes are particularly abundant in barley. And so barley is used in the fermentation process, not necessarily as a flavorant, but as a source of enzymes that allow the breakdown of those starches. And it's very important in the process of fermentation of grains or potato starch or any other form of starch. So barley is very important, not so much as a food in and of itself, but as a component of the brewing process. Okay, so that finishes things up for us for monocots. There was a lot of information, but the things to pull out of this are some very, very important economic families and some very abundant families. The most species-rich families, of course, are the Orchidaceae and the Poaceae, and those are going to be true on the worldwide basis. Later on, when we get to dicots, we're going to highlight a few more of the very species-rich members, especially in Alabama.